So in Haiti, we'll move now to kind of talk about the agents of resistance. In Haiti, one woman said, "There were many demonstrations with many people, all people except those with money and food." So here we just kind of see this picture from the international media. It's kind of just showing Haitians, regular Haitians out on the street demonstrating. But we have this other group of people emerging. And this is in the case of Haiti, we had some powerful political and business people who were paying students, gangs, and organized kind of provocateurs to escalate the street protests through violence. And this was an influential strategy that kind of heightened the media attention and creates political disruptions. So I think this picture was kind of more to instigate sort of a political disruption. We see this guy here. He doesn't necessarily look like he's starving. He looks quite tough. He's standing there, he's holding this bowl of grass, he's shoving it in his mouth in the face of a UN troop. So he's creating this kind of, really trying to get this international attention. And that kind of brings us to our third group of agents, which was the UN stabilization mission that was there in Haiti at the time to kind of combat this domestic resistance and try and restore order. But in Haiti, this approach really escalated feelings of anger. So the agents of Cameroon, this story is quite interesting because the protest that was initially organized by the transportation unions manifested as battles between the state and protesting youth. So one woman said, "Taxi drivers and bus drivers were on strike because of increasing fuel prices, but the rioters were Cameroonian citizens." So we kind of have this strike and this riot happening simultaneously. So after a few days of protest, and in a paternalistic way, Paul Biya appeared on TV and issued a stern warning to Cameroonians to stop the mayhem, vowing to prosecute to the fullest those demons and apprentice sorcerers who had manipulated Cameroonians' youth. So Biya really thought that juju was at play here. So to combat the protests, Biya brought to Yaoundé, Douala, and other cities in the country Cameroon's elite paramilitary force, the BIR, the Rapid Intervention Battalion. There were also local police and military forces, but this force is very spectacular in this case because it's traditionally and commonly used just to guard Cameroon's borders between Central African Republic, Chad, northern Nigeria. So in this case, this paramilitary force was brought in to kind of use against its citizens. And that brings us to the sites of resistance. So the sites in Haiti were public spaces, and the protesters were really strategic in the sites that they chose. They really wanted international media attention, like I said. So here we have one person saying, "Yes, the food rotting in the port caused a lot of rumors because imported food prices were raised. So the people went to the palace and tried to knock down the fence to get the prime minister." So the palace in Port-au-Prince was kind of symbolic of the political nature of the food riot and calls for a change in government. So another woman said that you can still see the scars of the violent manifestations in the city today. So they're still very apparent. So images like this one were all over the international media and later became a book cover for this particular food issue that came out in 2009. And this kind of expanded on the commonly held food riot narrative that Evan set up and described. But this was more through kind of a food sovereignty perspective offered by Raj Patel and colleagues at Food First. So that brings us to the sites in Cameroon. In Cameroon, the strikes and protests were underway in 5 of Cameroon's 10 regions, or in about or over 25 cities. So the sites were strategically chosen to create this domestic disturbance. And so here, interviewees really kind of assumed that these sites were well known. And those interviewed mentioned Douala and food markets as the sites of resistance because markets were closed, so people really felt disconnected from these places. So there were barricades on roads and bridges into and out of cities. And Douala in particular experienced the greatest unrest as the BIR was firing indiscriminately into protesting crowds. So we have this quote here: "It wasn't a very good time for us. I almost got shot by a police officer in Mutengene. I was around an area where young boys were throwing stones, and the police officers almost shot me." So that was a really powerful quote for me. I was kind of surprised to read one like that. But this other one: "The riots in Douala caused a lot of deaths and prevented a good number of households from having food." So I showed this picture of the bridge here because the Wari Bridge was very much a site of unrest during this time in 2008. So the BIR was stationed on either side of the bridge and the protesters on the middle, because their plan, their strategy was to block food from moving into and out of the city. So this bridge is kind of the outside of Douala's port. So I'm basically sitting where the port would be from this picture. And the port was stopped, and what happened was the BIR and also helicopters were flying over this bridge, firing into the protesters in the crowd. Some people were jumping off over to the bridge, and this kind of crackdown in Douala suffered the greatest number of casualties in most of the food riots at this time. So the death toll from indiscriminate shooting is absolutely debatable. The government says and estimates around 40 numbers of death, whereas this report came out from civil society groups a few months after, where they kind of interviewed people in Douala to get a sense of what was happening at this time. And these civil society groups in Cameroon suggest that the death toll is well over 139 people, and that the number of arrests were around 1,600. So this report is very revealing of kind of what was happening at this time. And that brings us to the strategies in Haiti. So in Haiti, the strategies of resistance discussed in their interviews really centered around food consumption and coping strategies. It wasn't really resistance strategies that people were focusing on, because people were really concerned about what they were going to eat. So people were stressing that the cost of living is too high, and we're eating to fill our stomachs, things must change, and people just want to get through this time. So here's one image from a protester, Levish Beval, that's Creole, for the cost of living is too high. And a quote from this time: "When food prices increase, I buy half of what I used to buy." So coping strategies were definitely a theme that was emerging from these interviews. But in Cameroon, it was kind of different. In Cameroon, people were concerned about consumption, but this took on different forms. So whereas in Haiti they say, "We're making the ground hot," in Cameroon they say, "When there's a strike, everything stops." So when the taxi drivers were on strike, there were barricades on the roads and bridges into and out of the cities, like this one. They were burning tires, and protesters were just really trying to block these routes, creating this domestic disturbance, and really trying to, what people were saying, alter the food supply chain and paralyze the market. And so the markets did close, and people were really concerned about where they were getting food. So this strategy halted the movement of food, creating temporary scarcity, driving food prices higher, closing the markets. One woman said, "Yes, the riots prevent the households from provisioning, and the traders lose business. There are damages and fires." So when we look at the outcomes, or kind of the impacts from this resistance, we see kind of short-term and long-term. So overall, diets were changing in both places. So in Haiti, one woman says, "The people demonstrated in the street, and the government worked to reduce the price of rice." But during this time, people would choose to eat more rice and forego other foods when food prices increase. It's kind of a cheaper option at this time. People were eating more from their garden, people were reducing the variety in their diets, and people were kind of concentrating their consumption on starchy filling foods like rice, spaghetti, and cornmeal. But in Cameroon, the short-term impacts, people were really just concerned about what was happening. We had serious injuries, deaths, fires, confrontations between vendors, policemen, food shortages. Vehicles were not bringing food to the market. So in Cameroon, the consequences of the market closures forces people to suffer, as food is very hard to find. So what really surprised me in this case was that famine was mentioned 60 times in the survey in Yaoundé. And this isn't really a characteristic of Central Africa, because in this case, food was available but not accessible. So I kind of get a sense by using this word famine that people really, really were concerned about where their food was coming from, and the fact that they couldn't see it in markets was actually really disturbing, because typically in these places, there's tons of food in the markets, and it's kind of taken for granted that it's always there, but people have these images of other parts of Africa that kind of bring about these other kinds of words that really typically aren't common in this part of the continent, really. So this, I think, was really linked to this instability, fear, closures of the markets, and the stopping of all sales. There was also an absence of supplies to keep the market open, like I mentioned. So because no transports, foods were actually rotting in the fields and the farms outside of the cities. They couldn't transport the food in. There were fires, there was burning of the market structures and food, destruction of perishable products, and an increase in food prices. And some of this was happening in Haiti, but just not to the extent that it was in Cameroon. So that kind of brings us to our long-term impacts. But in Haiti, we see this kind of story that emerged at the time, and this is a story from Al Jazeera, where the Haiti senators called the prime minister to quit. So in the wake of food riots, they asked the prime minister to step down, and he did. And this only happened, if we look at the date, 3 days after the major riot event. So we learned that the riot started kind of the 4th, went to the 7th, so 3 days after, on April 10th, Prime Minister stepped down. But in the Cameroon case, we see this story from the French media that says, after the food riots, nothing changed. And this is kind of a partner with Radio France International and this website. But then what's really kind of interesting about this, the story came out, if we look at the date, 1 year after the food riots. So 1 year after, they say nothing's changed. And I kind of think that this is kind of still happening today. So a lot of people that are complaining that food prices are still too high, and this is in both places. So we're asking people to remember back to the days of the unrest, but the common theme from both of these cases today is that we're just used to it now. And one woman in Haiti said, "I risked my life for nothing. Food is still very expensive." So I'll just go through quickly some common themes, some similarities and differences. We have, in both cases, corruption, poverty, and inequality. The form that the protests took in both cases were quite similar, manifestation and demonstrations. The agents in both cases were marginalized citizens, youth, traders, and people that were unhappy with the government. And the sites were similar, public spaces and roads. In both places, we wanted to see the slowing of commerce, military intervention, and in both cases, diets were changing. People were eating less. But I think the differences are the most interesting here, because kind of the background context and the things that brought about to instigate these protests was just these food rotting in Haiti's ports. So people were saying it was a rumor, some people were saying it was absolutely true, but in both cases kind of fueled this public outcry that it's like, if we're so hungry, why does it have to be right there and we can't get it? And in Cameroon case, we have this authoritarian government that's been in power for 26 years who then just makes an announcement to the country that we're changing the constitution, I'm going to stay around a little longer. And that also made people quite angry. In both places, we have the forums that were a little different in that Haiti had massive public demonstrations, and Cameroon was quite a little bit more violent. The strikes and protests just kind of took on more a violent form. In Haiti, the agents were paid. There were also regular citizens on the street, but there were also these other people that were kind of instigating this and kind of, escalating